Varnishing is an aesthetic choice that some artists may choose not to do, but there are definitely a lot of things that we need to cover and should cover so that you can do it correctly. And the reason I say that is when we take a look at our tech line, our help line, varnishing is the most common thing that we get questions about. And unfortunately, a lot of times what I find is it can be a little bit heartbreaking because often varnishing isn't something that's taught, or maybe students don't think about it a whole lot because we're just busy learning how to paint. We're not thinking about that end result. So I often find that people will varnish right before they've gotten a piece of work that's going to hang in a show, and then they do it very quickly and they haven't had a lot of practice, and then mistakes get made. And that, again, that's kind of heartbreaking to see that. So let's cover a few things. First of all, varnishing can protect from dirt, dust, abrasions, and it can offer some UV protection. Now, when I say UV protection, keep this in mind. There are UV inhibitors in the 11 Liquitex varnishes that we offer, but those UV inhibitors, they're sort of, I like to think of them sort of like sunblock, right? You don't want to put sunblock on in the morning and then never reapply all day long, right? It's gonna wear off over time and you're gonna need to reapply. So UV inhibitors do break down over time. The best thing you can do for your work is make sure you're using paint that is made from quality light fast pigments. If you're using any fluorescent colors, which are dye-based, make sure you have them hanging out of direct sunlight. But those UV inhibitors are there, so they will help. Now, the 11 varnishes we have are in a whole bunch of different sheens. So matte, satin, gloss, high gloss. So whatever your aesthetic needs are, you've got a varnish to match that. And they're good for inside or out. There are also some permanent varnishes and ones that are removable as well. So let's take a look at those. When we look at this container, this happens to be matte varnish here. And one of the things that we look at with this orange label, and when it just says Liquitex Professional mediums and it says varnish, this right here tells us it's non-removable. The words are on there. So this is water-based and you cannot remove it once it's put on the surface of the painting. And the water-based permanent varnishes should only be used for acrylic paintings. And that differs from Liquitex Soluvar. This happens to be the gloss variety. And the name Soluvar means that it's a solvent-based varnish. Soluvar, solvent-based varnish. And this can be used for acrylic or oil painting, so either or. And it can be removable with mineral spirits. So later on down the road, should something happen to your painting, maybe it gets marred, some sort of damage, with mineral spirits, you can remove this varnish and then reapply. And I always like to think of varnishes like the clear coat on a car. It should be this thin, discreet layer that's protecting. It's invisible. You don't even know it's there, but you know it's protecting that paint surface. And then there's also spray variety. Now the spray variety comes in the permanent, which is this one right here, or if it says Soluvar, then it's again simply that solvent-based varnish, which is removable but in a spray form. Now, the good thing about sprays, I really find those useful if you're somebody who makes artwork that is highly textural or even sculptural, because sometimes when you're applying varnish and it's a very, very textured surface, you can get areas where the varnish pools in there, or as you're brushing across a rough surface, it can agitate and cause foaming and things like that. Now, the other thing before I talk about applying varnish that I want to point out, if you have something like the matte variety that we showed here, or satin, matte or satin varnish is basically a gloss varnish that has a matting agent in it. So why is that important? Well, if your varnish is sitting for a while, that heavier matting agent can drop to the bottom of the container. So you need to make sure that that's stirred up really well to make sure that it's homogenized. Otherwise, if you just pour off some varnish off a satin or matte that's been sitting a while, that matting agent may not be mixed in, and then it's gonna look like you have a gloss varnish. So be aware of that. And be careful stirring it up. If you shake it a lot, you can get bubbles. Now, however, this is sort of a do as I say and not as I do. Oftentimes, I want to make sure that matting agent is really, really mixed up well. So I will shake it, right? I'll give it that, but I won't pour it out right away. I'll let it sit for maybe 15 minutes. That matting agent isn't going to sink all the way to the bottom again. It's just going to leave enough time for the bubbles to dissipate, and then you can apply. Now, the other thing you want to think about is drying time. So if you're using the Soluvar and you're putting a coat of varnish on an oil painting, please, please, please make sure that you let that oil painting dry for 6 months or so. And that seems like a tremendous amount of time, but oil paint has to dry by oxidization. It has to take on oxygen. And it's a slow process to do that. And if you varnish too early, you can seal that off from the oxygen it needs to fully cure and fully dry. And that's where I talk about that heartbreak sometimes when people apply too quickly, they seal it off and that paint film remains perpetually tacky. Now, if it's acrylics, you think like, well, they dry very, very quickly. I would still wait about 3 days or possibly a week for a thicker application, because the acrylics dry not by oxidization, but they dry by evaporation. So the moisture and the water has to evaporate out of the film. And if you varnish too early, you can trap that in there and it can end up looking cloudy. And you can't fix that. And you don't want that happening. You want the clarity and the richness of your work. So let's do a quick little varnishing lesson here. And this happens to actually be an oil painting, something I grabbed from the studio right here. So I made sure Soluvar, so that's what I used here. It's gloss Soluvar. And one of the things I've done is I've poured it in this little cup here. And this is something I wanna mention that's important. I want you to have a clean container, and I want you to decant the varnish into that container, because a lot of times what I see on social media is people will take a bottle and they pour it right onto the surface of the painting. Now, if you've had success with that and it's worked and it's been fine, I'm not here to tell you never ever do something just because I say so, but you can run into issues. You can have too much varnish on there. That can make it longer to dry. You could have the increased possibility of brush strokes. Things can settle in the varnish film and that can lead to a whole bunch of problems. So I like to make sure that you put it in a cup. The other thing I like to do is make sure that you have a brush and it's dedicated. You'll notice this doesn't have any paint particles in here because I don't want to have any of that. Possibly, if it's not fully dried and it's in there, it ends up getting in the varnish and we end up coating our, sort of glazing our painting otherwise. So I'm gonna take my brush and I'm gonna dip it in here. And then, I wanna just rub that against the edge. I wanna take some varnish off of there, because again, it should be a discreet coat. And then I'm just gonna run that right across the surface like that. And I wanna show you here before I do anything else. Yeah, you can see how that's made the color more saturated. You can obviously see, well, it's wet right now, so of course it looks glossy, but it's gonna look glossy when it dries. But you can really see that saturation. And then I'll just take a little bit more off here without even dipping in there. And I'm just gonna come down here because there's enough on that brush. Now, one thing I wanna say about the brush, and then I'll continue. Use the largest brush you can for the job. So if you were working on an 8-foot painting, don't use this brush. You're gonna have so many brush strokes across that whole thing, a whole painting. Try to use the biggest brush that you possibly can. So I'm gonna come in here and just reload again. I think I probably actually still have enough on here, but just for illustration purposes, I'll reload and I'll take off any excess. And it's good to do this flat, just like I'm doing, so you don't have any dripping. And again, I'm gonna come just overlapping each time. Again, one more time. Take off the excess, that's important. Again, I don't want drips. I don't want more than I need. And I'll put this last coat on here. And when I do that, it's something that I can kind of look in raking light and see if I've missed any areas. However, one of the things I suggest, if I see that I've missed a spot, the varnish is going to start to dry pretty quickly. You want that to happen. You don't want varnish to be wet for a long time. Again, more things can possibly, dirt, dust, and things could settle in the paint film. So it's going to dry rather quickly. So rather than going back into it and maybe gunking that up by dragging my brush through an area that started to dry, I would let this dry overnight. And if I see any areas that I missed, then I would varnish again, but go perpendicular to the original mark. So my original marks went this way, I'd come back this way, and I would try to coat that, and all should be good. It looks pretty good though, I think, and it looks very saturated, really nice. You can see that sheen on there right now. There's definitely practice involved in varnishing. I absolutely suggest that people do that. One of the little tips I would do is just, since you want to do this rather quickly, put a coat of black paint acrylic paint down on maybe a little canvas board or scrap canvas or whatever it is that you have, and practice varnishing on that. And I say black or something really, really dark because you'll see more easily where you've missed things. You'll be able to see if you have too much varnish on there, if you're getting any bubbles or things like that. So practice is really good. And finally, if you're on Instagram, head over to @TFACNA, that's the Fine Art Collective North America, which is our education feed. And if you scroll through the live streams there, we have a whole entire live stream just on varnishing. So we really spent time getting into the weeds of it, getting into the details. And likewise, if you visit @Liquitex Official and scroll through the live streams there, we've done another one on that feed, and that'll give you a lot of great information to make sure that you do your varnishing properly and you're happy with the end results.